the thunderstorm visitor. A few weeks ago, I found myself alone at home on a stormy night. The weather had been unpredictable all day, and by the time evening rolled around, the sky was a deep, menacing gray. I had settled in for the night with a book, trying to ignore the occasional rumble of thunder that grew closer with each passing hour. As the storm intensified, the wind picked up, howling through the trees outside, and the rain began to lash against the windows. I could feel the tension in the air, the way the storm seemed to be building to something. I wasn't particularly nervous. Storms were common enough, but there was an uneasy feeling that I couldn't quite shake. Then, just as a particularly loud clap of thunder shook the house, the power went out. The sudden darkness was disorienting, plunging everything into an eerie silence, broken only by the sound of rain pounding against the roof. I fumbled for my phone, using its dim light to find the candles I kept in a drawer for just such occasions. I lit a few, their flickering light casting strange shadows on the walls. I tried to keep reading, but the storm was growing more violent, each crash of thunder rattling the windows. The house felt different in the dark, the familiar rooms taking on a strange, almost sinister atmosphere. The wind seemed to be whispering against the walls, and every creak and groan of the old house set me on edge. That's when I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. It was faint at first, barely audible over the storm, but it was there. The unmistakable creak of a floorboard, the kind that only happens when someone is walking across it. I froze, straining to hear over the pounding rain. For a moment, there was nothing, and I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. But then, I heard it again, closer this time, like someone was moving through the house. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest, the candlelight flickering wildly as I moved. I told myself it was just the storm, that the wind was making the house settle in strange ways. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The sound was too deliberate, too slow, like someone was trying to be quiet. I grabbed my phone and used its light to scan the room, but everything seemed normal. I slowly made my way to the hallway, every instinct telling me to stay quiet, to stay alert. The creaking continued, now unmistakably coming from the living room. I held my breath as I peeked around the corner, expecting to see something, someone there. But the room was empty, just the furniture casting long, distorted shadows in the dim light. The sound stopped as soon as I entered the room, and for a moment, the only noise was the rain hammering against the windows. Then, without warning, a deafening crash of thunder shook the house, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. The room seemed to darken further, the shadows stretching into corners where the candlelight couldn't reach. I stood there, paralyzed by fear, convinced that if I moved, I would hear the sound again, that something, or someone, was just waiting for me to make the wrong move. But the silence dragged on, and slowly my rational mind began to take over. It had to be the storm. That was the only explanation. Still, I wasn't taking any chances. I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, making sure everything was secure before retreating back to my room. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that I was safe, that it was just a storm and my overactive imagination. I spent the rest of the night sitting on my bed, the candle burning low, the storm raging outside. The house was quiet now, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept expecting to hear that sound again, the creak of a floorboard, the faintest hint of movement in the dark. Eventually, the storm began to pass, and the first light of dawn crept through the curtains. The power came back on with a soft hum, and the house returned to its normal, familiar self. But even in the light of day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been in the house with me that night, something that the storm had brought to life, if only for a few hours. To this day, I still can't explain what happened. Maybe it was just the storm playing tricks on my mind, or maybe, just maybe, there was something or someone there with me, hidden in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal itself. The Phantom Texts. A few nights ago, I was home alone, enjoying a quiet evening in. It was just one of those nights where everything felt peaceful, and I was content with the stillness that filled the house. But that calm was shattered when I heard a loud banging coming from next door. At first, I tried to ignore it, thinking it was probably just the wind or maybe an animal knocking something over. But the banging continued, growing louder and more persistent. It was strange because I knew my neighbors weren't home. They had been gone for a few days, and their house was supposed to be empty. Curiosity got the better of me, so I grabbed a flashlight and headed over to check it out. As I approached their house, I could see that all the lights were off and the windows were dark. But the banging continued, echoing through the night. I walked up to the front door and knocked, calling out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" There was no answer, just the eerie silence of the empty house. I tried the door, but it was locked. I walked around to the back, shining my flashlight into the windows, but everything inside looked undisturbed, almost like no one had lived there in years. Feeling uneasy, I decided to head back home. As I was walking away, the banging suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe just the old house settling, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Later that night, as I was getting ready for bed, my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from my neighbor, the one whose house I had just checked. The message was short and frantic. "Paul, please help me. I'm trapped." My heart skipped a beat. I quickly typed out a reply, asking what was going on and where they were, but as soon as I hit send, the message vanished from the screen. It wasn't just that it didn't go through. The entire conversation thread disappeared, as if the message had never existed. Confused and a little scared, I tried calling my neighbor, but the call didn't connect. It was like their number had been disconnected. I sat there staring at my phone, trying to make sense of what had just happened. How could they have sent a message if their phone was off? A few minutes later, another text came through, this one even more urgent. "Paul, please, they're coming for me. Help." But just like before, the message disappeared the moment I tried to respond. I didn't know what to do. I felt a surge of panic, wondering if my neighbor was in some kind of danger. I even thought about going back to their house to check again, but something stopped me, a deep, unsettling feeling that I couldn't explain. The next morning, I went over to their house again, this time in broad daylight. I knocked on the door, but no one answered. I looked through the windows, but the house was still and empty, just like the night before. Later that day, I ran into another neighbor and asked if they had seen or heard anything unusual. That's when they told me something that sent a chill down my spine. The family that lived in that house had moved out years ago. The house had been empty ever since. No one had lived there for a long time. I tried to process what I'd just heard. If the house had been empty, then who had sent those texts? And what had caused the banging noises that night? I never did figure out what happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was trying to reach out to me from beyond. Now, whenever I pass by that house, I feel a cold shiver run down my spine, and I make sure to keep my distance. I haven't heard anything from that number since, but the memory of those texts still haunts me, and I can't help but wonder if whatever was trapped in that house is still waiting for someone to answer its call. The Midnight Knock. A few nights ago, I found myself home alone. It was one of those rare evenings where I had the house to myself, so I decided to enjoy the quiet. I made some tea, put on a movie, and settled in for a relaxing night. It was peaceful, just me, the flickering screen, and the occasional creak of the old house settling. As the night wore on, the quiet became almost too quiet, the kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every little sound. I brushed it off, reminding myself that it was just the house and my imagination playing tricks on me. But then, just as I was about to head to bed, I heard a knock at the door. I paused, thinking I must have imagined it. Who would be knocking at this hour? It was close to midnight and all the neighbors were usually asleep by now. But there it was again, a soft, deliberate knock. My heart started to race as I approached the door. I peered through the peephole, and sure enough, there was someone standing there. A man, probably in his late 40s, looking a little disheveled. He wasn't someone I recognized, and that made me uneasy. "Who is it?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. The man leaned closer to the door, his face partially obscured by the shadows on the porch. "I'm your neighbor," he said, his voice calm but with an edge of urgency. "My car broke down just down the road. I was hoping to use your phone to call for help." Something about his tone didn't sit right with me. I knew most of my neighbors, and I didn't remember ever seeing this man before. Still, I didn't want to be rude. I hesitated, debating whether to let him in or not. The longer I stood there, the more insistent the knocking became. Reluctantly, I decided to open the door, just a crack. But as I did, a chill ran down my spine. The porch was empty. The man was gone. I stared at the empty space where he had just been standing, my mind racing. I hadn't heard him walk away, hadn't seen him leave. He was just gone. Confused and unnerved, I closed the door, locking it tightly. I even double-checked all the windows and doors, making sure everything was secure. But as I stood there, trying to make sense of what had just happened, the knocking started again. This time, it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside the house. My blood ran cold as I turned, staring at the door that led to the basement. The knocking was coming from down there, steady and relentless, echoing through the silent house. I felt a surge of fear, every instinct telling me to run, to get out of the house, but I was frozen in place, unable to move. Slowly, I approached the basement door, my heart pounding in my chest. The knocking continued, louder now, more forceful, as if something on the other side was desperate to get out. I stood there, my hand hovering over the doorknob, too terrified to open it, too terrified to ignore it. The knocking seemed to reverberate through the walls, filling the house with a sense of dread that was almost suffocating. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. Silence fell over the house once again, heavy and oppressive. I waited, holding my breath, but there was nothing. No sound, no movement, just the eerie stillness of the night. I backed away from the door, my hands shaking. I knew I couldn't stay in the house any longer. I grabbed my keys and phone, bolting out the front door without looking back. I spent the rest of the night at a friend's place, too scared to return home until daylight. The next morning I went back to check the house, but everything seemed normal. No sign of the stranger, no sign of anyone else having been there at all. To this day, I still don't know what happened that night, or who or what was knocking on my door. But one thing is certain, I've never felt safe in that house again, especially when I'm alone.